Hey everyone, it's Dr. Marcon, and this is Chapter 3 on membrane transport, the last part of Chapter 3. So the learning objectives that we want to cover in this part of Chapter 3 is explain, identify how stuff being solutes and water, crosses membranes. We also want to determine the direction of the movement of water in different situations. So we talked about some of the common components of all cells, and we know that all cells have a plasma membrane. Now, the plasma membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. So bi means two, so there are two layers of phospholipids. This plasma membrane controls what enters and exits the cells, and this is a property known as selectively permeable or selective permeability. So the plasma membrane being selectively permeable, this means that it allows some things through while preventing the passage of others. Now, if you click on this YouTube link, it will show you some of the general properties of the plasma membrane. So what is the plasma membrane made up of? We talked about the 4 macromolecules earlier, and we know that we have lipids, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and proteins, and we also know their basic components or monomers. So what is the plasma membrane made of? Well, we talked about a specific type of lipid, which were phospholipids, but we know that there are also carbohydrates and proteins that help make up plasma membrane. So the lipid component of the membrane structure includes phospholipids. So the layer is made up of mostly phospholipids. They're arranged in 2 layers known as the bilayer. And we can actually see the generalized structure of a phospholipid with the hydrophilic head. Hydrophilic means it likes or loves water, whereas the hydrophobic tail, which means it is not really fearing, but doesn't really like water that much. And here we can see the different components of the phospholipid. So we can see that basic structure of lipids includes glycerols, as one glycerol and fatty acids. So phospholipids do have that glycerol and the fatty acids, but attached to the glycerol is a phosphate group, which makes it a phospholipid. And the phosphate attached to the glycerol contributes to that hydrophilic head of the phospholipid. Meanwhile, we have chains of fatty acids forming cholesterol that contributes to the hydrophobic tail. So the structure of the fatty acids and cholesterol help form that hydrophobic tail. So putting it all together, the plasma membrane does have a lot going on. Again, we have lipids, we have carbohydrates, we have proteins that form carriers for certain molecules to be able to enter and pass through the plasma membrane. And again, here is that YouTube link that kind of describes the different properties of the plasma membrane. So what types of stuff need to get in or out of your body? So we are made up of different molecules, molecules, vitamins, things that our body needs that need to go through the plasma membrane. For example, sodium chloride or sodium. We need sodium for different things, potassium. All these molecules are needed to be transported in and out of the body. So where does the stuff go once it enters your body? So for example, if we eat salty foods or drink Gatorade that has a lot of electrocytes, usually this stuff will enter the cell, or it will go to tissues within the body that need these molecules. And how does it enter? So we have different types of transport. The first type of transport we're going to talk about is passive transport. Passive transport is when we have molecules that move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So here we have our phospholipid bilayer making up the plasma membrane of the cell, and we can see that there is a high concentration of molecules outside of the cell, and these molecules will then travel from the place of areas of high concentration to low concentration. It's not really indicated here which one is outside of the cell or inside the cell. Just know that passive transport molecules will move from high to low, okay? And the most important thing to note is that there is no energy required for this type of transport. So passive means no energy required. Usually the energy that is used for active transport is ATP, but ATP is not required in order for this passive transport to occur. Passive transport may or may not use protein channels. So again, protein channels can be embedded within the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane to kind of help the movement of the molecules from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. But again, no energy is required. Now, when the direction of the movement is again from high concentration to low, and this is usually down a gradient. So imagine you're on a bike and you are at the top of the hill and you bring your bike down to the bottom. No energy is really required to push yourself or bike yourself down that gradient. So you are passively kind of traveling down that hill, down the gradient. Not using any energy at all. So again, passive transport is at no cost to the cell, no energy is required. So we have different types of passive transport. We have simple diffusion, which you can see in this diagram here, where again areas of high concentration molecules to areas of low concentration just diffusing through the plasma membrane. We then have facilitated diffusion, where we have the aid of protein carriers that help move these molecules through the plasma membrane from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And then we have active transport. Again, active transport requires energy. And we'll talk about active transport in just a little bit, but know that active transport requires energy to help fuel the passage of molecules through the plasma membrane. And in just a little bit, we're going to talk about osmosis. Osmosis is a specific type of passive transport. However, when we talk about osmosis, we're talking about water molecules, good old H2O, and the movement of water molecules. But again, osmosis requires no energy, so that is why it is called a specialized type of passive transport. So with diffusion, some molecules will diffuse or go through, right through the plasma membrane down their chemical gradient. Again, going from areas of high concentration to low concentration. Simple diffusion is passive transport, but basically it's a spreading out of particles. So we can see here, we have two beakers, actually just one beaker, and we drop a colored tablet into the water. So what happens as the tablet dissolves, the color molecules will then diffuse throughout the beaker, filling the beaker and changing the color of the water within the beaker. So simple diffusion happens over a concentration gradient. Again, we have that concentrated tablet in one part of the beaker, and the molecules will then spread out on their own over time eventually. So simple diffusion happens over a concentration gradient. However, as time passes, there will no longer be a concentration gradient as the molecules have diffused out and dissipated within the solution. So here we see after time has passed, The molecules have spread out, going from that area where it was super concentrated to all of a sudden diffusing out throughout the solution, no longer creating a concentration gradient. So it has diffused throughout, and that's how we see the solution within that beaker obtaining the full color of that tablet. Now, some molecules will need a tunnel to get from one side of the plasma membrane to another. In this picture, we see a nice person kind of walking, an elderly person across the street, kind of facilitating her movement from one side of the street to another and helping her along, making sure she doesn't get run over by that biker dude on his bike or hit by other bikers that are kind of also crossing the street. So when we have a tunnel or, for example, a transport protein helping with the diffusion of molecules from one side to another, this is called facilitated diffusion. So the transport proteins that are embedded within the phospholipid bilayer help to facilitate diffusion, help the molecules go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Again, this is a type of passive transport, and this requires no energy. Sort of opposite that, we have active transport. Again, active transport requires ATP to allow for transport of molecules from one side to another, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. So now we want to determine the direction of the movement of water in different situations. When we are determining the direction of movement of water, we want to basically determine the direction of osmosis. Okay, so movement of water is basically what osmosis is. There was an important case study in which there was a competition. I believe it was in Europe or England somewhere, where it's hold your Wii for a Nintendo Wii. What does osmosis have to do with Jennifer Strange? So the competition was basically these participants had to drink a certain number of bottles of water within a certain time frame, and they had to hold their urine, and whoever was able to hold their urine the longest, they would win a Nintendo Wii. I still actually play the Nintendo Wii. However, it's an older version that lets me play the Dance Dance Revolution, but that's besides the point. Anyways, it had some very dire consequences. If you want to follow that case study, please watch the YouTube video to kind of understand what happens when we drink a lot of water over a long period of time and how it affects the body. And we're actually going to talk about, the different ways that water moves across the plasma membrane of our cells. So again, osmosis is the movement of water across a membrane. H2O, or water molecules, will move across the cell membrane to balance solute concentrations, or concentrations of stuff, of molecules. And of course, this affects cell volume. And then the volume of your cells will depend on what's outside of it. So we have a plasma membrane. We call it a semi-permeable cell membrane that kind of separates the inside of your cells, which is considered intracellular, from the outside of the cells, which is considered extracellular. Now here we can see sort of an equal number of molecules and water, both in and out of the cell. If there are equal amounts of solute, in this case it's salt, then there is no real net movement of water from one side to another. So no net movement. This produces a sort of equilibrium. Okay? So let's consider the three scenarios. First, why do you think they give you saline and not pure water at the hospital? So here's a lovely bag of saline. Normally they will give you normal saline, which is about 0.9% sodium chloride, because we know that the body, while it is made up of 60% water at least, we also have other stuff that makes up who we are. For example, sodium chloride. So when we have isotonic solutions, talking about solutions that surround the cell. So when we're talking about an isotonic solution, we're talking about the solute concentration outside of the cell. In an isotonic solution, the concentration of the solutes outside of the cell is equal to the concentration of the solutes inside the cell. So we have equal out and equal in the amount of solutes. So because there is an equal amount of solutes, an equal amount of stuff, there will be no net movement of water. Water will kind of be in equilibrium between the inside and the outside. And then the cells are able to maintain a normal volume in isotonic fluids. So when we see the cells, if we drop a red blood cell, for example, into an isotonic solution where the the solute concentration in the solution is the same as the solute concentration within the cell, again, no net movement of water. The cells are happy. They stay in their regular normal volume. So that is why we give an isotonic solution or normal saline instead of just pure water, because we know that there are an equal amount of solutes within the normal saline as inside our cells. Okay, so again, no net movement of water. Cells are happy in equilibrium. A hypotonic solution. So hypo means below. A hypotonic solution is when we have within the solution a lower amount or lower concentration of solute compared to the solute concentration within the cell. Okay, so what's going to happen? So water is going to move from an area of low concentration to high concentration. So the net movement of water will be into the cell because it wants to dilute the solute concentration within the cell. So water will move from outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, and what might happen is the cell may swell and burst. So if we look at a picture of the cells in a hypotonic solution, we can see these kind of big chubby cells that may burst if any more solution or any more water goes into the cell. Okay, so that is in a hypotonic solution. In a hypertonic solution, so hyper means above or more than, in a hypertonic solution, the solute concentration outside the cell, as we can see, is a lot higher compared to the solute concentration within the cell. So where is water going to move? Water is going to go again from an area of low concentration to high concentration because it wants to dilute that solute concentration. So in the instance of a hypertonic solution, the net movement of water will be out of the cell to where there is a higher solute concentration. And what could happen is the cell may shrink and die. So here we see these shriveled up little cells because all the water has moved from inside of the cell to the outside solution, which is hypertonic, meaning there's more stuff or more solute concentration within that solution. So those are, we talked about the different passive transport types. We talked about diffusion. We talked about facilitated diffusion as well as osmosis. So really quick, we'll talk about active transport. Again, active transport, by the name, it implies that it does require energy. It requires energy to actually move molecules from an area of low concentration to high concentration. Okay, so kind of the opposite of passive diffusion. So energy is required to move molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration. Think of biking up a hill, so it's going up the gradient. So energy is required to move these molecules up the hill from an area of low concentration to high concentration, and that is the basic idea of active transports. Okay, so that is the last part of Chapter 3 on membrane transports and the end of Chapter 3.